Okay, hi, and welcome to a special edition of the MCC Brussels Podcast. We're recording this just in the run-up to Christmas. I'm Jacob Reynolds, the Head of Policy for MCC Brussels, and delighted to be joined today both by Professor Frank Füredi, our Executive Director. Frank, hello.
Hi there.
And also Bruno Waterfield, a seasoned Brussels journalist and correspondent. And we're going to be digging in over the next period of time into some of the main stories of the year, reflecting a little bit on kind of what's really been moving the needle here in Brussels. There's obviously we could have been sport for choice in terms of major events that we might cover in this, but today we're going to cover some of the things that we think really under kind of commented on that we need to reflect a little bit more on. So to start us off and to kick us off, we're going to talk a little bit about Qatargate. I don't think we need to remind anybody about the kind of main headlines of the stories, the bags full of cash, the dodgy relationships between NGOs and the kind of Brussels set. And there's new revelations coming out almost every week. But for us, I think the real story almost seems to be how this has been repeatedly kicked into the long grass by the Brussels elites. We've said all along that uncovering the relationships between NGOs and the EU institutions is very, very important. But Frank, if I start with you, how do you think this has happened that such an important story has managed to get repeatedly kicked away?
Well, I think there is a very interesting dynamic at play here, which is that as far as the cultural and the political elites in Brussels are concerned, corruption is a problem when it's being committed by their political enemies. But when it's their mates who are caught in the act, they have a very different approach to it altogether. And the thing that I find quite interesting when you look back upon the past year is not necessarily the corrupt behavior of a number of MEPs, but just the kind of total indifference with which this issue has been treated. It's almost as if there is no political dynamic that seeks to expose them. So, for example, if this was to happen in Washington, by the Republicans, then the Democrats would be on top of that, and they would, like an angry sort of crusader, would do their best to kind of nail the Republicans, and vice versa. Whereas here, it almost seems as if there's no serious group of individuals within Parliament or elsewhere who are interested in digging deep on this, and that involves everybody, not just simply people on the left and the Greens, but the other side too appears to have gone to sleep on this issue instead of trying to capitalize on it, instead of trying to make some political points in relation to that.
Yeah, no, very true. Bruno, what have you made of it?
Well, I was trying to work out what the biggest consequence was of Qatargate for the European Parliament, and the biggest consequence, as far as I can tell, is Mark Tarabella, who's a Belgian socialist MP, is one of the suspects. In the case, was always traditionally the man who organised Santa Claus celebrations in the European Parliament. Often he'd dress up as Santa Claus himself. He has the right kind of belly for it, as you'd imagine from a Belgian socialist who likes eating out the brasserie and all the rest of it. And that seems to be the biggest loss to the European Parliament this year, is obviously he can't really go around handing out presents to people and staff in the Parliament, because it wouldn't be a very good photo opportunity. So that seems to be, as I said, as Frank was saying, there hasn't been any huge consequences. It's been business as usual. Eva Kaye is obviously out of jail now and popping down to Strasbourg or wandering around Brussels doing her job as an MEP. It's always interesting to note that the European Parliament is where all the scandals always happen. The European Parliament has a gentleman's agreement, it's called, with the European Council, that it will always get 20% of the administration budget. And scandals come, scandals go. The Parliament never cleans up its act, and the gentleman's agreement remains intact. And I suspect until the day that somebody says that gentleman's agreement is now broken, look at the lot of you, and the European Parliament will continue. They'll find someone else to do Santa every year, but it will just continue as it always has.
And it's interesting that there's nobody in Parliament who's devoted to exposing the case, because usually in a political sort of institution, there's always one or two people who are really on the case, and they will do their best not to let go. But it almost seems to be the case that people have just gone to sleep, they switched off. And sometimes you almost think there is a kind of conspiracy of silence on this, which tells you quite a lot about the political culture in Brussels itself, that it's this kind of soft corruption rather than the Latin American kind of corruption, soft corruption where people are for sale, and as long as there are plenty of buyers for whatever they're selling, life will continue as before.
Mm. There's a paradox as well, because before the real rise of populism, before there were substantial groupings and blocks of MEPs in the European Parliament who were hostile to the European Parliament was much more open to self-criticism, and it was much more open to having public discussions. Now the Bureau of the Parliament, this very shady body of vice presidents and many vice presidents of the European Party, which is all the stitch up between the main parties it meets in secret, is totally unwilling to look at any of this, because they say it will be seized on by the populists. And on top of that, obviously, you have this endemic corruption in the European Parliament where everybody benefits. And this is the whole point, that everyone benefits from the setup in the Bureau, because every single political bloc is represented there, and it becomes in their interests very quickly to make sure they get the jobs on the committees, etc.
As far as I can see, I mean, taking that further, because the same thing applies to they were discussing, it seems to have disappeared or dissipated, but the same impulse seemed to drive the response to transparency reforms, and we might make kind of our criticisms of the drive to transparency, and certainly not everything needs to happen. Kind of there's a place for meetings and all the rest of it behind closed doors, but the impulse around the updating transparency rules was always that, oh no, we can't allow it to be seen exactly what's going on, because then all those nasty populists will seize on the relationships between certain NGOs and the Brussels kind of intellectual and EU elite.
That's right. I think there's two things that slightly surprised me, not very much. The first one is the point you make in relation to the NGOs. I wasn't really aware of the depth of the collaboration between the NGOs and the Parliament and the different committees of the Parliament. That is something that came as a little bit of a surprise to me, because I thought there was more of a distance between the two. I actually imagined that things were done a little bit more delicately than they are. And it seems to me that the NGOs have become the unofficial wing of Parliament almost, where they kind of provide parliamentarians and their council with virtually all the material, all the ammunition they need to make their political points. But the other thing that surprised me, and it just shows you how naive I am, was the ease with which foreign nations, nations like Morocco or Qatar, and now here Mauritius, are able to essentially buy off parliamentarians and influence NGOs. And that came as a real surprise to me. And it really shows you that the European Union's border is not just simply porous in relation to migration, but it's also porous in relation to the purchase of political influence. And that kind of level of corruption is a little bit surprising, especially as so many of the parliamentarians appear to take corruption formally very, very seriously and go all about it all the time when it comes to their political enemies. But the influence of foreign nations, or at least the ease with which they buy influence, is really well worth thinking about in terms of its meaning.
And of course this was uncovered because Belgium was carrying out an investigation into whether Morocco was influencing its MPs and its parliament and its ministers, and it stumbled upon this particular NGO operation. It raises some very, very important questions in terms of who really runs the European Parliament. And it raises, as Frank said, some interesting questions how the legislative process works in the whole of Brussels, in the fact that it is essentially a clearinghouse for different lobbying interests, to the point where the Commission actually funds a lot of NGOs to offset the balance, to give them a bit more of a level playing field with business. And of course, business being what it is nowadays, it is very promiscuous, and it is very easy for foreign interests, substantial foreign interests in terms of China, for example, as well, to influence the process here in a way that's absolutely invisible, but it's very, very powerful.
And it is, when you think that there's a double process going on in Europe, on the one hand, a lot of foreign nations buying football teams, buying infrastructure, buying bits of business and prime property, buying land, on the one hand, and that's kind of going on, sort of under the surface and having a very major impact upon the economic and socioeconomic life of European societies. When you add to that the European Union itself is complicit and actually almost works as a salesman for foreign interests, and individual MEPs seem to be in the business of peddling their influence. You really know that rural Europe has got a very major problem.
Mm-hmm. So we couldn't do a year in review without mentioning how Hungary has very much become established as and intensified over the year as the kind of big bad wolf of EU politics. There's been lots of hand-wringing about Hungarian influence in Brussels, including about us, and we're happy to take the press. But I mean, recent developments over the year with Tusk now in Poland. Does Hungary kind of stand alone? Are these things set to intensify? Obviously, we're speaking in the middle of the EU summit going on, and there may be a deal, there may not be a deal, but there's this sense, isn't there, that the EU almost needs Hungary as much as Hungary is kind of fighting for its own national interest. There's this weird dynamic where the kind of whole moral and intellectual apparatus of the EU requires this kind of foreign enemy, domestic enemy in the form of Hungary, as it needs it. It's like it's other that it requires in order to establish its own sense of moral superiority. What have we made of Hungary and the outsized influence it's played in EU politics over the year?
I think the danger of it definitely has. I mean, Hungary has become like a pantomime villain. I mean, our whole MEPs are politicians in the European Union who never talk about their own country or the problems faced by their own country or their own people or their own voters or constituencies, but always go on and on about Hungary, and they're absolutely obsessed, and they make it up. I mean, some of it I was reading on social media last night, a quite significant figure in a Hungarian NGO who was claiming that the Hungarian government detains opposition MPs and opposition figures and beats up students, which is totally untrue. It's a total fabrication.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're talking about Hungary, you can almost say anything because you just have to link the accusation to Viktor Orban, and a certain group of people will go along with it. It's like cheering the villain and pantomime behind you. I think the problem becomes, it's a problem for the EU as well as Hungary, is if it becomes like a structural, inbuilt sort of relationship where any government that pursues openly pursues a policy of national sovereignty, which is entirely within the lines of the European Union and its treaties, is stigmatised and turned into a villain, and the operation of the European Union in terms of funding is completely, for example, completely disrupted. I think that's a real warning sign for the EU, and we're seeing a shift in the EU because the EU is moving into geopolitics, and geopolitics is binary. You either are on side or you're not on side, and if you're not on side and you're on Putin's side, you're the enemy. So geopolitics is very binary. It's either or. It's black and white. And of course, the EU really performs well when it's not black and white. And when it's grey, it does deals, it horse trades, and then presents the deals in whatever way everybody can live with. But geopolitics just isn't like that. And I think the danger for Hungary and the danger for the EU is once you start presenting all of these decisions that used to be horse trading as simple geopolitics, the EU is in real danger itself of fracturing.
Yeah, it's not just the kind of presenting things in binary geopolitical terms, well, it's the moralisation, the intense moralisation of these issues as well. What have you made of it, Frank?
Well, it's now come to a head in a number of different ways. So, as we alluded to, Hungary, if Hungary didn't exist, it would have to be invented.
Yeah.
Because hatred directed at Hungary seems to be a legitimating force for sections of the European Parliament who basically dine out on Hungary, and by promoting scare stories, it's a way of trying to gain moral authority for themselves. Because what they're really saying is that, look, we are virtuous, we're on the moral high ground, and these Hungarians are totally corrupt. They don't believe in the law, and they do all these terrible things to their own people. And that kind of narrative, that kind of fabricated narrative, is something that after a while they deeply kind of believe in. And I was surprised. Just yesterday I was talking to a couple of people who are around Renew, and the minute they recognized me, it was almost like they were off and with their anti-Hungarian, it was a rant, it was a genuine anti-Hungarian rant, which I think it's almost as if they've been programmed by it. So there's that kind of element. But the other element that's quite interesting is having tried to punish Hungary by not withholding funds from Hungary, but as a result of various stories that they kind of made up. They do realize that there's a certain limit as to how far you can bend the rules and how far you can go in terms of withholding funds and using money as a weapon for blackmailing a particular country, which is why I think they're slightly reining things back in and are saying that some of this money can be released to Hungarian society, and they also are much more wary of basically playing for high stakes in the geopolitical game, because they also recognize that the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, which had a lot of moral prestige attached to it, if you were for Ukraine, is becoming a little bit more complicated, and therefore with Zelensky losing popularity, with a certain degree of war weariness in Poland and the Czech Republic and elsewhere, you got to negotiate these things a little bit more delicately, and therefore what you end up is a situation where one or two things can happen. One possibility is, and this seems to be the case in the short run, is that by backtracking, the EU actually humiliates itself, because the very fact that it's got to give some money, and everybody knows that nothing has changed in Hungary. And, there wasn't a problem to begin with, but nothing has really changed. It's all a game, all a facade. So by kind of conceding that, you are to some extent being a little bit humiliated. But there's also another problem, which is on the other side of it, which is that given that they've invested so much moral resources into basically targeting Hungary and really nailing Hungary, I can see a situation where with the Hungarian presidency coming up, they're going to really go all out to try to sabotage it and try to somehow sort of create a dynamic where it will be very difficult, they hope, for the Hungarian presidency to be an effective sort of force.
There was that fantastic quote, wasn't there, when they announced that they were going to release some of the funds a couple of days ago, and they said, they were forced to say that the fact that we're releasing, and this is almost a direct quote, the fact that we're releasing these funds on the exact same day as the European Council is a pure coincidence. Yeah. It's like even they can't believe it, and that really, really speaks to the point that even the kind of whatever authority the EU institutions have left is really being compromised by the open nature of how this is becoming a sense of dealing rather than actually really about values or the rule of law or anything like that.
Well, when you have a situation where federalist German MEPs are saying, accusing the European Commission of giving a bribe to Viktor Orban, you can see how far it's gone. I mean, the European Commission is actually his greatest asset in the sense that it represents an authority, a level of authority, particularly on competition and the single market, which is absolutely integral to the project and completely unassailed, and it is now being assailed by federalist German MEPs who are accusing the European Commission of being so bent as Viktor Orban. I mean, how bad is that?
Yes. Anyway, it's going to be very, very interesting, because Hungary will not go away. And I think what's interesting for me is that with the elections coming up, a certain kind of dynamic has been put in place, which creates the possibility that there'll be a slight shift in the balance in Parliament, which creates a situation where it's a little bit more difficult for this kind of lynch mob mentality that is promoted in the Parliament to have that kind of momentum that it had in the past year.
And I think it's also, I think the point that Frank was making about geopolitics focuses the mind, and you do have to think about what your alliances are, you need to think about your own territory, where you want to influence, is one of the things that's very, very interesting in the current debate, particularly around Ukraine and whether it should be a member of the EU, as it raises the question of the Western Balkans, where the EU arguably has a much bigger geopolitical interest, or has a bigger geopolitical interest in any ways. And one of the linkages to Ukraine being considered for membership is Bosnia being considered membership. Hungary supports it, Italy supports it, the Austrians support it, and very strongly. Bosnia isn't a country, it's a protectorate. It can't even make the political constitutional reforms to effectively become self-governing. So if you can have membership negotiations with Bosnia, you can have membership negotiations with anybody in the name of geopolitics. So I think, in a way, the more the EU really does grapple with geopolitics, the importance of countries such as Serbia, for example, in terms of the EU's external border, Hungary's border, you're going to see some of these lines blurring because there are different national interests coming into play as well as to which part of Europe is the most important.
And there's also a high level of dishonesty in terms of calling a spade a spade. So, for example, a lot of countries are against Ukraine becoming an EU member, because of agricultural interests, because they know that if Ukraine became a member, the amount of subsidies it would need would be quite phenomenal. So they're quite happy for Hungary to make that point, but they themselves have the same view on this, but they're keeping really quiet about this. So there's a kind of sort of silence on how you express the.
Well, they want Hungary to be the fall guy for what they can't say openly. Right?
Yeah, but there's a real problem with it because it's bad faith. I mean, it's quite literally bad faith. And one of the very, very few successes, the real success the EU's had in the last generation is actually enlargement and negotiating the transition from the fall of the Soviet Union in large parts of Europe. It's been relatively successful on its own terms. Anyway, they are damaging that because they are essentially offering Ukraine something they really have no intention really of giving. They're setting the bar really, really high in terms of institutional reforms that have never happened in the EU's whole history and seem even less likely to happen. So they're in danger of their bad faith in doing something symbolic for Ukraine to Trump-proof as well, just in case he wins the next American elections. Is in danger of damaging something that's actually very precious to them.
And they did something similar with Turkey, and they kind of dangled the possibility of EU membership, never intending to do that. But I should just say that from a Hungarian perspective, enlargement would be a really good thing, particularly in the Balkans, if you could get Serbia and all these different countries in, just because in terms of security and stability, it would make life a little bit easier for the Hungarian society.
Well, it was apt that you mentioned Trump because I wanted to kind of the third major thing that I wanted us to reflect on over the year is populism. And I mean, I still remember even probably as close as a year ago reading all the articles, populism is dead, it's over. Sure, they would grant that there'd be an election here and there, but people were pretty certain that the kind of populist genie was put back in the bottle and there'd never be anything like Brexit or Trump ever again. And then the year almost began with Germany sending itself into a tiz, or politicians openly calling to ban the AfD just in case they might have too much influence or win. But through the year, there's been lots of surprises. Obviously, the major event was the Dutch election, and that really kind of shaken things up and surprised even people who were watching it very closely. So people assumed populism was over. I don't think it is. What's going on? What can we expect?
Well, the big story is the other side of the populist advance, which is a crisis of the mainstream parties in Europe. And Holland is a very good example where all the classical post-war parties have gradually unraveled. You're now getting the same situation in Germany, where the two big parties are on the defensive. So in general, what we're saying is that the mainstream parties have lost their capacity to motivate and inspire. And you have a result of that, the crystallization of a certain confidence to challenge this. And Holland and Germany and Italy, with Maloney and elsewhere, we're seeing that. There have been some setbacks for populism, such as the inability of Vox in Spain to kind of break through and in fact losing a degree of electoral support, which shows you the dangers that if you come into an alliance with a centrist party and you don't really have a clear independent voice, you're going to lose a lot of momentum. And I think that's a lesson I would draw from the Spanish experience. But by and large, I'm really pleased that populism, whatever that means, has come to the surface because it reflects the demand for a voice, the demand on the part of a lot of people to be part of the conversation. At the moment, it's politically unformed and it's very diffuse politically. But I think on balance, it's really where the future of Europe lies. If that populist momentum can gain traction and become a little bit more sophisticated and more self-confident, I think that will be a very positive step forward for the European continent.
Bruno?
I think it's really interesting if you look back over the whole debate about populism or the far right, hard right, national populists, whatever they get called at the various moments. In the discussion was that the tactic was what was called the cordon sanitaire, was to all group your wagons, centrist, mainstream wagons, whatever the centrist mainstream was at any particular moment, and exclude anybody else who was pushed to the fore by the voters. And if you look at the wasteland that has created, I mean, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands got some 25% of the vote. All the mainstream parties, the most important post-war party in the Netherlands was the VVD. That was down to like 16%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's absolutely astonishing. There's 16 parties in the Dutch, 150 MPs, 16 parties. It's absolutely smashed because if you look at the political wasteland from the point of view of a mainstream centrist, that is France, where it's either Macron, who can't stand again, or Marine Le Pen, who's reinvented herself brilliantly and is wonderful on the radio and doesn't say anything extreme anymore, but is abhorrent to certainly the French political class. I mean, it really is a wasteland. It is astonishing. And Spain is that.
Yeah, there is that. I think Spain is also now more complicated by the fact that the Sanchez government has given a lot of scope for regional sort of autonomy, and a lot of people see this as almost like the fragmentation of the Spanish state, and there is some truth in that, because the dynamic is far deeper and far more potentially conflict related than, let's say, between Scotland and England, even though the Scottish have been demanding independence for ages. But in Spain, you can really see a situation where the Spanish constitution will not be able to absorb all these different sort of regional pressures. I should have said something about France earlier on, because France is really interesting. I've been there a few times recently, and I've been surprised by the way in which the Rassemblement National has almost become like the 21st century equivalent to what Gaullism used to be in the previous era, and kind of almost, I don't know whether consciously or unconsciously, is kind of providing a certain degree of latitude for that tradition to kind of come alive again. And the thing that I'm puzzled by, I'm not sure about, is that given at the moment that the Rassemblement National has got this forward dynamic, is it possible for them to do what Meloni did in Italy, or will the French, sort of stay the old French establishment, do whatever they can to thwart that and to ensure that somehow they are prevented from coming anywhere near power, even though their political party, their movement is far greater, far larger than any of the other ones. So that's going to be a very interesting question for the future of Europe, because France, does matter quite a lot.
Mm. I think you can see that in Holland, in the Netherlands, with the coalition negotiations that are going on at the moment, and the effort to get Wilders to give constitutional guarantees, because there are elements of his manifesto that, in terms of religious freedom, that were unconstitutional. Meloni, I think, may actually be the framework that a lot of people in the EU are beginning to stumble towards, which is the cordon sanitaire doesn't work anymore. Can you defang, can you tame some of these parties by using the prospect of limited political gains in office to tie them down to the old order, essentially?
It is, and they've been able to do this because Germany has been relatively committed to this strategy of trying to neutralize Italy and Meloni, trying to make sure that she adopts a very pragmatic profile. To some extent, they've succeeded in doing that. But given the fact that Germany now has got its own internal problem with the with the AfD, it's going to be a little bit more difficult for them to play their role confidently, which is why one of the things that I see happening is that the CDU, the CSU are becoming much more panic-like. I mean, they seem to be the most, they seem to have the most to lose of any movement in Europe, and therefore they are desperately trying to hold on to the vestiges of their political influence. It's worth also noting that they're also the most, paradoxically, the movement that's most hostile to Hungary. I mean, you mentioned the word, Ungarn, and they will just go, apoplectic.
But it's interesting because in Germany, or particularly in Bavaria, you have attachment to socially conservative values is actually a real thing. I mean, it's a real part of people's lived experiences. They're not like a metropolitan Berlin elite that sucked in the CDU. In places like Bavaria, it is a very, very real thing. And for parties to feel that they're being squeezed away or pushed away by decent mainstream opinion from being able to express those values, I think is a very, very big deal. It's impossible, actually. It's literally they'd be cutting their own throat. And I think it's that's for another very interesting dynamic that's going on at the moment, is that the more there's been a push to undo some of those particularly lived experience ways people actually live, such as farmers, particularly we're seeing at the moment, the danger of further fragmenting the mainstream and further isolating it and further estranging it from what once was good society is really big.
Yeah, and it's good you mentioned farmers. We've had reports out across the year on a kind of range of issues. We talked about farmers, had a great report on farming. We talked about the way that Hungary became a kind of a necessary evil for the European Union. We had a great report that looked at how the kind of LGBT agenda kind of was created, forged in that area. We got lots of extra work planned for the next year that we'll be excited to share with you. But outside of our office and outside of our work, what are you two most excited about for next year? Frank, what should we look forward to? What can we find hope for?
Well, to be really honest, for me, the really important development will be the political discussion around the elections, because those discussions can have a far greater depth and can raise far more questions about what's going on in Europe than has been the case until now. I think one of the things that I'm hoping is going to happen is that finally a lot more people will wake up about the dangers represented by the culture war that's being more or less fought by one side, by the Greens, by the kind of so-called left within the EU, who've been systematically promoting their agenda, and very little kind of sort of reaction from their opponents. But I do think that the moment has now come where different sections of society are waking up to the fact that their way of life is being seriously undermined by the anti-civilizational sort of values that are being promoted throughout Europe. So for me, that's going to be an exciting opportunity. And I just hope that we here in MCC Brussels can play a good role and a positive role in terms of providing people with arguments and encouraging people to find their voice in relation to this.
Yeah. Bruno, what are you excited for?
Well, I think the elections are going to be very important. They're going to be very important because based on the current polling, the Eurosceptic conservatives and the sort of nationalist populists combined to oppose them, particularly because of the tensions within such a coalition. The idea that the EPP, the sort of former Christian Democrat conservatives, would totally be on the same page at all moments with sort of radical Green types is just not very convincing. It would be very, very difficult to sustain that, and it would further undermine their own basis, I think, if they tried to exclude that. So that is going to be very interesting to see whether that can be accommodated at all. And I think a lot of people in Brussels were really horrified to see how badly Frans Timmermans, the climate pope, the Dutch socialist, who was supposed to go in and at least rally the sort of pro-EU, metropolitan, woke, if you like, middle class in the Netherlands. Now, he came second in the elections, but he came second on performing really, really badly because everyone else did so badly apart from Geert Wilders. He came in second with about sort of 15-16% of a vote, and people are really horrified about that because he's a pretty good operator, and they really hoped that he could sort of stake a claim to the middle ground, and it was a disaster. And I think the worry now about the European elections is beginning to mount.
Yeah, because they are yesterday's man. I mean, that's becoming more and more clear. They were very effective when they had a kind of basis to what they were doing, when they were not facing the kind of challenges that confront them today. But when you talk to or see a lot of these people in action, they seem lost. They're living off the past, and it's unlikely that they're going to be able to sort of navigate their way through the hurdles that kind of confront them in the period ahead.
Yeah. Well, thanks for joining us for this special episode of the MCC Brussels podcast. We'll be back in the new year with more podcasts, more reports, and if you're in Brussels with us, lots more events. So we do hope to see you at one of those. But for now, have a very Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year from all three of us here. So thanks a lot.
Yeah.